So, yeah, this is Crime is Language 2. I wonder what Crime is Language 1 is. But this is Hyperviolence in George Bataille's Concept of the Sovereign by Claudia Simone Dorchain in the Athens Journal of Philosophy. Oh, this is interesting. Volume 1, Issue 3. So I wonder if this is a new journal. I wonder if this is brand new. Like, this is literally 1-3. And from September, right now. So cool. You think that's right? Or thank you. It's funny. I used to listen to this podcast years ago, and the guy would just butcher names, and it was like a little bit on purpose. But he would just say, "I can't get the names right," and I was always like annoyed with him. I'm like, "Why can't you just get the names right, man?" It's like, "Is it that hard?" It's like, "Yes, it is that hard. It's just there's too many names. They come too fast, and you can't like go ahead and try to find them all ahead of time. It just does not work. It's like it would take way too much work." So, anywho, so here we go. Crime is Language 2. Hyperviolence. Hooray! Video games, hyperviolence. Okay. A philosophical discourse on the language of violence has gained a frightening topicality in 2022 due to the unmediated Russian invasion of Ukraine with its war crimes in February of that year. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been shot dead in Kyiv, Mariupol, Bucha, and elsewhere, some victims brutalized, raped, and tortured before their deaths, individual corpses mutilated, cut up, or disemboweled after their deaths. These crimes are excessively excessive violence, which is the phenomenological definition of hyperviolence. This form of violence is at the same time a cultural historical atavism as something that no longer seems to have a place in current Western societies, as it originates from a much earlier era and transports norms remote from the present. Moreover, it is also a non-verbal but differentiated language, which, according to Wilhelm von Humboldt, conveys a worldview, and like any language is both ergon, work, and energeia, will. Work and will in the sense of excessive violence and the corresponding attitude are personified here in a type of criminal sociopath that has a name in George Bataille, the sovereign. To what extent does the sovereign use this language? How can it be recognized at an early stage in order to prevent its escalation? Yeah, Goethe, good luck. Yeah, that one I at least have to. I've heard that one in. Like I used to call him Goethe before I knew it was Goethe, but I don't even think I say it right. But at least I'm not saying Goethe. Okay, so this is gonna be talking about violence at this point. Sociological violence research. 3 stages of escalation, transgression, and hyperviolence. Not all violence is the same. Recent sociological... Oh, wait, did I... Oh, man. Hold on one sec. Let me just drop the link in chat. I know not everyone clicks on it, but I hope people, if they want it, they can at least get it. Oh, yeah, and feel free to ask questions about anything as I go. Not all violence is the same. Recent sociological research assumes several forms of violence that are either mutually dependent, as reciprocal violence, when victim and perpetrator stand in a fighting relationship to each other and measure their forces in counter-defense and repetition of attacks, or on the other hand, increase in escalatory violence, when the victim is no longer capable of counter-defense and the perpetrator can act without restraint. Even this rough distinction between reciprocal and escalatory violence shows that research on violence in terms of its classification of phenomena is at the same time also an implicit measurement of the resources of victim and perpetrator. The corresponding findings of dyadic relationships or asymmetrical wars, as the historian Herbert Munkler calls them, are fruitful sociologically, psychologically, and above all philosophically, because what is at stake here is the broadest sense in the human condition in its unenlightened and dark side. The Hamburg sociologist Jan-Philipp Reemtsma deals with such fundamentally asymmetrical situations between perpetrator and victim, which according to their dynamics are no longer reciprocal but have an escalating effect. And in his philosophical sociological research on violence, he assumes 3 types of violence: place-changing violence, abusive violence, and murderous violence. Okay, so yeah, we're really getting into the different kinds of thinking about what we can do when we have more power over somebody else and we don't like them. Okay. Place-shifting violence changes the location of the victim. In the case of individual crimes, it is the isolation of victim through confinement, encirclement, confinement, imprisonment. In the case of war crimes, it is the annexation or occupation of land. Abusive or raptive violence, the term goes back to Walter Benjamin and his extensive philosophical critique of violence from 1921, is violence that damages, abuses, mutilates, or rapes the body. In today's academic criminology, in addition to naming this physically active type of violence, which Riemtse classifies as abusive, there are also different degrees of damage with regard to the duration of the damage to the victim, but these are not relevant here. Finally, autotelic violence is homicidal violence applied to the individual as execution, applied to collectives as genocide. The three types of violence, according to Riemtse, occur in practice in individual crimes as well as in acts of war, mostly building on each other as a gradual escalation of violence, always when there is a fundamental asymmetry of resources between the perpetrator and the victim, and when resistance remains fruitless and only incites the aggressor to greater violence. Okay, so we've just got some breakdowns here. This is not like, they haven't said anything yet, but we're just talking about different kinds of things that can be done. So you're taking away agency, basically, freedom of movement, freedom of your own independence of your body in different ways. So you prevent your body from moving anywhere. You prevent the bodily autonomy because you don't have autonomy, and then you completely remove it in homicidal. Like you just remove the control function, homicide by death. Okay, but now we're getting somewhere. Hyperviolence. Hyperviolence is, according to the French Encyclopedia, violence that goes excessively beyond habitual violence. That is, it exceeds everyday and customary violence, which in turn allows for a fine differentiation and provides its excessive character. In the cases considered here, which are to be classified as typical, it goes beyond autotelic violence. In this respect, it is no longer included in Riemtse's three-stage scheme and represents a fourth escalation stage that occurs when the autotelic violence has already been carried out and the victim is dead. Hyperviolence is the violence that not only kills the victim, but also mutilates it or renders it unrecognizable, making the victim, as it were, posthumously a non-human, deprived of all dignity and individuality. For reasons of scientific precision, we distinguish here and in the following between the systematic and historical levels of hyperviolence. Systematically, hyperviolence is the continuation of Riemtse's three types of violence and aims at posthumous aggression and escalates the violence of execution. Historically, hyperviolence can be understood as a very old, archaic, and barbaric form of violence that was already known in the earliest cultures and was also depicted in written and pictorial evidence. Yeah, I mean, this is the old making a scene out of it. It's not a question of violence, but it's making the violence that you're using the violence to make a scene for other people. So you're violating now other people by doing bad things that they even see the bad things is even then a violent act. The problem of excessive escalating violence, which is not even satisfied with the death of the victim, that is, which goes beyond the autotelic level of violence, was depicted in European literature at an extremely early point in time. It's like, go Europeans, good for you. You got to the hyperviolence very quickly. It can already be found in Homer's Iliad, which according to Diodorus was written at the time of the Trojan War, that is the 7th century BCE, when the barbarian Achilles drags the body of the slain Hector across the field in a triumphal procession and cruelly disfigures it by making the corpse take on the color of the soil and rendering it unrecognizable. Hyperviolence, however, does not remain in antiquity and already there as non-verbal language of the barbarian, but continues through further stages of historical development with ever new protagonists as perpetrators, and it is precisely these perpetrators who often keep the world and posterity in suspense with their inhuman deeds. In 1961, the French philosopher Georges Bataille reported on the true criminal case of how Marshal Gilles de Rais, known as Retz in a Briton knight and companion in arms of Joan of Arc, kidnapped more than 200 children, according to others' estimates even more than 600, locked them up in his castle, sadistically sexually abused them, hanged them and ritually executed them, devoutly contemplating their torn out entrails. On a systemic level, characteristic of hyperviolence as a type of escalatory violence is the total asymmetry of perpetrator and victim, which cannot be reciprocal anywhere, but is represented by a total imbalance of power. On the one hand, the experienced heavily armed martial rates, on the other, defenseless children. Writer and painter Pierre Klosowski examines similar asymmetrical wars and takes a philosophical look at the controversial works of the Marquis de Sade, with their numerous reference to torture and hyperviolence, for which Sade himself, who spent a large part of his adult life in a mental institution or in prison for violent crimes, represented both philosophical literary theory and empirical practice. Klosowski comes to the conclusion that de Sade's works, in addition to autobiographical references to an undoubtedly disturbed and highly criminal personality, also contains references to the political sadism of feudal rulers. This insight from the perpetrator to the system will be examined later. It is rare to find such perpetrators in empirical research who, like de Sade, take the active and descriptive perspective literary monstrosities. Historians and war correspondents know not fictional but real hyperviolence in the concentration camps of the Second World War, where violent dressing up was part of the tactics of psychological warfare, and currently in the occupied territories of Ukraine, where civilian victims in the villages of Bucha and the surrounding area were and still are mocked or mutilated even after their death. The violence, which extends beyond death, is also intended to disfigure the victim for posterity and thus constitutes a kind of extended execution with a partial or total prevention of the memorialization through disfigurement or destruction of the corpse. In this way, too, the victim is posthumously denied its human dignity and the grieving family is repulsed. Hyperviolence tears apart the bond of remembrance and thus the culture of remembrance as a specifically human form of recognition. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's like people just want closure, and in some sense, this is denying them that they can't get even the remembrance of the way the person was. And there's something sort of worse about not just killing a person, but then destroying their memory too. So, this is a overly graphic paper. It's very unusual for philosophy. Let's just see. Yeah, well, it's gonna keep going. Yep, on to 10 pages. Interesting. Alright. Hyperviolence and the history of ideas in Western philosophy, a barbaric transgression criticized since Homer's time. The philosophical critique of the cultural phenomenon of hyperviolence was already evident in the earliest times of cultural history and can be found in writers of antiquity who, on the one hand, describe hyperviolence and on the other hand, already find words of rebuke, since they too feel the rupture that this excessive violence has on memory, family, dignity, form, all systems of meaning. The philosophical critique of violence increases in the course of history. While antiquity already condemned this form of excessive violence and assigned it to culturally inferior actors, early modernity found contemptuous criticism for it as a generally inhumane procedure, and postmodernity relegated it as an atavism outside its own sphere of validity. Anyone who used hyperviolence was not modern, was not a contemporary. This corresponds to Max Weber's laconic conclusion that violence was simply part of everyday life in most cultures and epochs, but that only modernity problematized it, and that therefore the excess of violence in particular did not become a fact of modernity, but a phenomenon with which modernity had a problem. If we follow the systemic development of the historical arguments from literature and philosophy, we actually find the triadic, barbaric, unchristian, unmodern, as a progressive pattern of rejection within the critique of violence. First of all, Homer contributes to this by portraying hyperviolence as unmistakably barbaric, since it marks the barbarian Achilles as such as a non-verbal act and distinguishes him negatively from the more civilized Greeks. Hyperviolence as an act thus already marks a special dyadic relationship of asymmetry in antiquity and at the same time a cultural difference between perpetrator and victim. If one considers how important Homer's epics were in Greek culture and in the education of children, According to recent research by Thomas Slezak, one can assume that at least ancient Greek took the cultural condemnation of hyperviolence as a violation of norms seriously. The cultural condemnation of the perpetrator of excessive violence beyond death was preserved in the centuries following antiquity, but found its way into literature only sporadically. In the 18th century, but even before Immanuel Kant's questioning of all instances in the state with regard to their legality, also and especially in their exercise of power, a radical ideological change took place. Violence, and above all hyperviolence, became a problem, not only for individuals like Homer and Hesiod, but in general as a movement that took hold of large parts of the intellectual community. Well, this is a good question. Why exactly do we dislike violence? I mean, is it the pain inflicted? Because everyone agrees that the pain is bad, but it seems like there's something else going on with violence that we dislike, and it's not entirely clear what that is. There is something about probability that I feel like is in the back here. It's like once you get beyond the regular and the routine of like a certain form of life, like life is full of routines. When you start breaking that down, you no longer have a way to sort of view the future, like plan your life out. And so this is sort of like, people sometimes say like stochastic violence, which is like you're just sort of breaking things like probabilistically, having sort of like stochastic terrorism. And this is supposed to like destabilize whatever society is, because you can't then plan society ahead because you don't know when the next thing is going to break on you. But that's a question. Like, what exactly is the planning? Why is this idea not built into society that things are going to break every so often? Are we overly controlling nowadays? And maybe that's why we're having such a problem with violence. I mean, in the United States, our problems are well documented at this point. We've got a lot of gun violence. Yeah, I don't know. But, like, have we been holding too close to the idea that like all violence is bad, and that's why not that violence is good, but have we somehow denied too much of how people need to express themselves, and that is really what is causing so much violence nowadays? I don't know, but it's a question. Why is this, as the author is contending, a contemporary problem, where we're saying this has no place in society, but clearly if it has a place in people, then it's going to be a harder sell to get it out of society if people are just violent things. Okay, in 1746, on the eve of the Enlightenment, which was soon to sweep through Europe like a beacon of light, the Catholic Church Superior Dom Calmet found astonishingly critical words with regard to such war crimes. Hyperviolence is unchristian and unethical. The inconvenient clerics support this judgment. What's an inconvenient cleric? The inconvenient cleric supports this judgment with reference to the patristic church fathers Origenes and Tertullian, and states that no one could be Christian who would approve of or sham legitimize war violence or criminal violence of this kind. This was courageous in a time when field preachers were still inciting soldiers in war, or even justifying all means in a Machiavellian way for the figure of the just war. According to Walter Benjamin, the problem of hyperviolence in early modern thought arose systematically from the problematization of natural law, which was no longer accepted unquestioningly or even identified with Christian norms. In 1977, Michel Foucault found the latest and at the same time strongest criticism of these excesses of violence, which are found in war among unleashed militaries, in peace among pathological lone perpetrators. Hyperviolence is first and foremost pre-modern, and according to its phenomenology, not a modern murder, nor really a medieval practice, although it does occur in the Middle Ages as a form of punishment, but systematically an ancient form of sacrifice rooted in ritual and cult. In this respect, a perpetrator is a pre-modern person who has fallen out of the present and personifies a reversion to an earlier sacred cultural level with all its negative Dionysian attributes. Okay, so this is interesting. We've gone back to, they're saying going back to some sort of ancient form of sacrifice rooted in ritual and cult. I mean, I don't like this sort of looking back as like some sort of more fundamental thing that you revert to. But I mean, people are looking for meaning, and when the contemporary stuff fails, they do go looking in other areas. And of course, the other ones, you know, you have ritual and cult somewhere, and people go that way. Yeah, but I dislike the notion of reversion here. Like, why are you saying we're reverting to anything? That's not, there's no reverting to, like, it's like some weird psychological, like, Freudian theory where you're reverting to, like, a prior state. But, like, we can't, like, jump 2,000 years to be, like, ancient Greeks. Not even, like Athens Greek, but like like the Hesiod Greeks. Like, why would we ever do that? Like, that would be very strange if we were all of a sudden to just go that way. Anywho, Back to the Future, the hyper-violent offender as sacrificing priest, or the anti-modern type par excellence. Hyperviolence is found, according to Foucault, as a relic of ancient forms of sacrifice in modernity, or as blood violence over life. In Walter Benjamin's words, when the perpetrator assumes the role of the sacrificial priest, as it were, and reduces the victim to mere life, the naked body. Here, finally, for the researching criminologist and psychologist or forensic scientist, there is the disturbing phenomenon of cultic self-aggrandizement or self-deification as a dominant personality trait of the perpetrator in phenomenology, but not as the motive for the crime. This is uninhibited, time-lasting exercise of power. The motive for action in the context of the cult also fascinates lay people. You don't know, Stoicism is trendy now? Yeah. But, that's not like what people revert to. That's what people, you know, like it. And I don't blame them for liking Stoicism, but it's not like you default to it. So I'm not saying that like these things aren't like the old ways aren't very attractive. I'm just saying the idea that there's any reversion to the old ways, like automatically, this takes a lot of work. People have put a lot of effort into, you know, going to read Marcus Aurelius and trying to like update this stuff for nowadays. But it's like I'm just more worried about like I said, this concept of why, how it happens. It's not that it happens, but why, but how it happens. Yeah. The how, not the why. Yeah. And I get it. I was kind of stoic for a while. Yeah. Well, that's fair. They reject modernity and they embrace tradition because they think that, for whatever reason, they don't like the modernity. And that's okay. You know, there's a lot to dislike, I mean, about what things that are going on at any given point. The idea that like there's more to be gotten out of certain traditions is fair, like completely. And trying to find a new way forward is always good too. So it's just again, like you have to take the good and get rid of the bad. And I mean, who am I to say that like what we're doing in general is like a good way forward? I don't know. But the question is, there is no like default to anything. There is no default anywhere for any of this stuff. And I think there's like good Nietzschean point, like where are you going to go looking for your morals? You can go look in the ancients, but you are basically like, but we've lost any default once we got rid of like the overarching religious structure that had defined a lot of our history. So it's like, yeah, you can embrace tradition, but again, which tradition? Why are you doing it? And it's like, there's no default. Okay, where was I? Yeah, it's down here. And like I consider myself like a neo-cynic. I do not, I agree somewhat. There's some overlap with Stoicism, but I go back to the cynics. I don't, yeah, like that's kind of where I draw some, like if I was going to go classify myself as something, I'm sort of a neo-cynic. I have not much love for most of contemporary theory, but there's not many people who claim neo-cynicism, and you can't even find people writing. Like, we've read papers on cynicism here. Aris suggested one, and it was funny because like I ended up saying, look, this is an interesting paper, but it was like stoic oriented. Like, it still didn't even get cynicism right. It was kind of talking about stoicism at the same time. And it's like, all right, you're just trying to get people who are also like in the modern sort of the contemporary think looking at stoicism, and you're trying to get them to think about stuff, but it was still more of a stoic paper than I thought cynical. So, but yeah, it's like, but where are you trying to draw the your way forward from? Like, what do you think is going to be good? Like, what things do you like? And it's like, there's no default. It's this is also in Hume. A fundamental problem in Hume is that Hume tells you two things. You have to have a sense of history, and then you have to be rational. And you can't, there's no real way to be rational about history. The history just is the history. And then, like, again, if you're informed by history, that's not rational. So it's like you've got these competing sort of ways of looking at the world. Do you look at it historically as like a progression, a la Hegel maybe, or do you look at it rationally and you try and decide what's best now, and then you don't look at it historically? It's like you look at it ahistorically, and you got problems there. So, anyhow, I'm just ranting. All right, but yeah, thanks for the comments. The sacrificing priest in the film and the human sacrifice is also a dazzling media figure today, which raises the question, why are film villains, for example in James Bond, often perpetrators of hyperviolence? The appropriate thesis is because their psychomoral structure represents an anti-modern type, the anti-type to modernity per se, the other in culture, atavism in the present, or in the return of the sacrificial priest as a haunting figure from the past. Hyperviolence remains, viewed in modern terms, a monstrous provocation, be it media fictional or real political. Why does this excess of violence shatter the self-understanding of an epoch? Hyperviolence as an individual act, that is the perpetrator-victim dyad, as well as a structural act by a supra-individual perpetrators, that is institutions, parties, corporations, is an atavism, reverses the process of modernity. Bullet 1. Modernity as a successive process of secularization, with thinkers such as Montaigne, Descartes, Spinoza, etc. growing out of the philosophical spirit of skepticism, is denied. Hyperviolence nevertheless again wants the archaic violence of the sacrificing priest as irrational, metaphysically transfigured power beyond death. You see, this is annoying me, is like starting to annoy me. It's like, this is like going back to some sort of again, it's a sort of default reversion, and I don't like that sort of sense of it. It's like, why are you doing it? There is a need to find something that you don't like, this secularization, and then you're going to something else. Okay, modernity as the idea of reason and rule is threatened, since hyperviolence denies all these achievements and, in an irrational act, establishes total violence beyond the violence of murder. Bullet 3. Modernity as individuality and the elevation of the ego is endangered, since hyperviolence destroys this ego identity to the point of de-individualizing the victim. Hyperviolence is as a figuratively staged rejection of secularism, reason, and individuality as the declared paradigms of modernity is thus pre-modern figure par excellence. Par excellence. Okay, so fine. It's saying, look, it's rejecting modernity. That's fine. It doesn't need to be pre-modern, but it does need to reject modernity in the way that modernity understands, and that does harken back to the pre-modern. Again, I'm a neo-cynic. I think about things like maybe as a cynic's were, but you have to get rid of the crap from before. That's terrible. You do not do, like, even Aristotelians, no one does any claims all the same things Aristotle claimed back in the day. That would be terrible. Same to anyone in the history of philosophy. You try to get rid of the bad stuff and keep the good stuff. Like, even someone from, like, I mean, Heidegger is the easy example, but like anyone from like the 1800s, they had different things. Like, so if you're looking at Mill or something, I'm sure you don't agree with everything Mill said. You might like certain things Mill said, and then you have to you have to replace certain ideas with other ones. And you can go to the pre-moderns, or you could do something else. You could come up with new things, and that's the thing. That's why I'm a neo-cynic. I'm not a cynic. Like, that would be stupid. Okay, personal tyranny. George Bataille and his concept of the sovereign. Is there a prototype for this pre-modern figure of the excess offender who is not even satisfied with the execution of his victims and who traumatizes the modern by violating all their protective self-understandings? Surprisingly, there is such a such a typology that assigns the act and the perpetrator. In philosophy, there is not only a centuries-old tradition of critique of violence and especially of critique of excessive hyperviolence, but also a typology of the perpetrator, a figure who personifies hyperviolence and is the declared perpetrator. We find it in a prominent place in the French philosophers Georges Bataille's work on norms, norm decay, and modernity. It is called sovereign. The sovereign as a psychopathological type in Bataille's work, not to be confused with the adjective sovereign state power, which in democracies emanates from the people, or the sovereign in the sense of a psychologically healthy, self-confident, normal citizen. Alright, so this is what the special sovereign is here, is a threat to the public in order and to peace. He is unrestrainedly violent, even excessively so. He lives completely in the moment, is accountable to no one, and creates and dominates the state of exception. Hyperviolence is the violence of the sovereign because in this figure the phenomenon of the excess of violence is, as it were, accumulated, or in other words, those who exercise hyperviolence stage themselves as sovereigns. Only the sovereign exercises hyperviolence. Hyperviolence is the violent language of the sovereign. You know what I'm remembering? This is like what are those like Dirty Harry movies from way back in the day where you've just got like violent, crazy people running around San Francisco. Like this is sort of what I remember back then. Wonder when Bataille, so Bataille was writing in the 50s. But like in the 70s we have like those just like crazy people who are like shooting up San Francisco. And like then you need Dirty Harry to lay down the law. So I didn't think of Dirty Harry as protecting modernity. But like that's kind of what it is. Like Dirty Harry is like, yeah, a man got to know his own limitations. Let us therefore look at the concept of the sovereign in Bataille and see what makes him tick. The sovereign is a barbaric concept of ruler. He rules without justification in Max Weber's sense, neither traditional nor legal nor charismatic. He does not recognize any limits to action and is completely self-sufficient in his destructive actions. Here's what I mean. A man got to know his own limitations. That's the Dirty Harry line from what? Magnum Force? And then, like, one of the assassins in one of the early movies, he's just shooting people violently because he likes to, fuck stuff up. And he's, like, completely crazy. Make my day, punk. His rule has clearly visible fascist features. The sovereign possesses the power to reduce the other to the naked body, to bare life, as Giorgio Agamben defines it. For him, the biopolitical body of his victim is only a projection and image surface, or as Nicolas Largier calls it, a tableau vivant, for ruling power relations. Here the sovereign is simply an extreme perpetrator of violence that reduces the body, as Rimsa already defines it. The reduction to the body carried out by the act of violence is the reason why violence must always be understood as primarily physical. But hyperviolence does more than reduce the victim to the body. It also manifests the cultural difference between the perpetrator and the victim, which Homer already saw, and eternalizes the power relations, and finally makes it impossible to give back the victim. The sovereign is a merciless judge of the victim beyond death, and thereby assumes a role that does not exist in civil law in the 21st century, even in state systems that still know death sentences for delinquent citizens. Whoever engages in hyperviolence as the alleged master of mere life undoes the systematic cultural developments in the Western understanding of civilizational progress, the sequence of which has already been historically set out in the civilizational drama Oresteia by Aeschylus, an itinerary development from the chaotic primordial state to the consensual liberal state contract. The sovereign lives ahistorically and completely in the moment, and therefore also denies modernity as a structurally linear process of development and gradual renunciation of violence in the individual and the collective of every kind, and the state in particular. Only the connection of the two philosophical structural concepts, hyperviolence and sovereign, shown here make this epic-breaking dynamic clear. For the ahistorical sovereign represents a culturally earlier state of, I hate the culturally earlier state. It's an acultural state, or atavism in his person, his type, and his activity, and his unrestrainedly violent and demoralizing action harbors the danger of catapulting the culture he tyrannically afflicts back to a more barbaric state. Also, this is this was the attempt of the Joker in the, what was it? One of the Nolan Batmans. He was trying to catapult the culture to just show it as it was, to get people to blow each other up, to go back to a more barbaric state. So that was kind of an interesting thing. It's just you overdoing the violence in, like, you know, the comic book sense, and that is kind of trying to pull at the strings of society to get it to come apart. And this is always a thing in comic book stuffs. Why are we living in a world with comic book villains, basically? I know this has been explicitly mentioned in some comics. Like, why are we in this place where there are just these comically crazy people? Like, why did they keep showing up? And like, that's a question that, you know, some of the more reflective superheroes ask. Like, why is there just always another crazy fucking criminal? So, and that's the thing. That's an atemporal thing. Like, it just always keeps happening. It's not like one happens after each other. It's just constant. Like, you can just keep going and keep getting more unrestrainedly violent criminals out of Gotham City, or whatever it was, as it were. I think the Punisher may have explicitly said this. I remember it being mentioned in association with the Punisher. Yeah, okay. Anywho. We're like, this is and I should be clear about what's annoying me about saying this is kind of going back to an earlier, more primordial state. Saying that gives it sort of a default status. If you're going to find an answer to any of this, you can't just go back to the way things were. Going back to the way things were is not going to solve any contemporary problems. You have to come up with something new. And so I dislike this sort of, like, I don't mind the discussion, but the defaulting of, like, this is like, oh, we're going to go back to some more barbaric state. Like, it's right here, back to a more barbaric state. You're not reverting to it. Like, even as they were saying, the Greeks already thought this was bad. And so the idea that we're reverting to a Greek way of life is like, no, the Greeks already thought this was bad. Now, are we reverting to something pre-Greek? Maybe, but that's not been argued here. And so I think this is an impediment to actually making progress. Like I said, you have to take what was in the past, because the modern way of thinking clearly cannot handle this level of violence. And I mean, yeah, I think the Batman stuff was, various Batmans were good for this. But like, yeah, so I find that disappointing in not understanding how, like, this stuff progresses. But again, this is like outside of the discussion directly. Okay, continuing. And as always, feel free to ask questions. The language of the sovereign. I am the Lord and God. I am your Lord and God. Sorry, I'm starting to lose it now. I'm out of water. So far, in this phenomenologically underpinned philosophical investigation of language and crime, violence has been symbolically assumed to be non-verbal language, and this striking equation also makes sense with regard to the sovereign as the perpetrator of violent excesses, because he usually speaks with weapons. But with the reductionist equation of violence as nonverbal language, the actual dynamic and thus also motivational level of human language development remains untouched, and thus will not open for insights into its development. For the philosopher and linguist Wilhelm von Humboldt in 1836, language was not merely a totality of nonverbal sonic or semiotic signs, but essentially always a Weltanschauung, that's worldview, and consists fundamentally of the two interrelated components: ergon, that is the visible system of signs, word, sound, and alphabet, and energeia, the basic mental attitude system of norms. Humboldt's idea was that the ergon of language only changes if the energeia of a language has already changed, that is, if the worldview underlying the language has changed significantly. The violent language of the sovereign as ergon is thus preceded by a maximally narcissistic, delusional, and sociopathic change of mind as energeia, which seemingly legitimizes him, and this may be true for individual offenders as well as for collectives. However, these apparent legitimations are not only thought but often verbally formulated when sovereigns of old and new times manipulate their future victims and suggestively announce their deeds, not infrequently by already implying asymmetric relations in language. Yeah, I mean, this is what like the comic book people do. They say what they're going to do, and then they go do it. And you're like, you can't stop me. Also, what's it called? The Thomas Crown affair. Thomas Crown is going to go rob a bank. Everyone knows Thomas Crown is going to rob a bank, and he does it anyway. It's like, you can't stop me. The later asymmetry of warfare, though through ever more escalating physical violence, is linguistically prepared by seemingly metaphysical justifications and exaltations of one's own person. Here again, Foucault's sacrificial priest becomes recognizable, who gives himself a nimbus, as well as through irrational claims to power that are not amenable to rational argumentation, and through generalizing formulations that exclude the individuality of the victim, which, as it were, anticipate the unrecognizability of the individual in the language. Here we find linguistic references to the three self-conceptions of modernity which the sovereign contradicts: secularization, unity of reason and rule, and individualism. Not only the violent actions of the sovereign, but also his speech patterns express his distance from the self-awareness and value consciousness of modernity. Apparently metaphysical justifications of one's own person and role within narcissistic, grandiose exaggerations remind the attentive listener of the sacrificing priest. Irrational justifications devoid of any logic and rationality, or even sophistical exaggerations of reason as such, prove that the unity of reason and rule, so typical of modernity, is vehemently denied. A generalizing, equalizing language, for example, civilian failures, average types, people of the world, denies modernity's strong reference to individuality and represents a rhetorical conditioning of the victim, who is supposed to feel as nothing special, mass-like, and indiscriminate. Significantly, this speech pattern of sovereignty was already identified in 1989 by the US-American linguist Noam Chomsky as a rhetorical technique of mass suggestion in modern media. That is, it is part of everyday life that is seldom questioned and desensitizes the contemporary to such presuppositions. You know, you got to be careful of this. I've seen this in person. When one person wants something from somebody else, you start seeing this sort of detachment of like the person as like something else. As it's very sort of, if you're looking for it, it's or if you're ready to hear it, it's very strange, because all of a sudden, like, the way one person's talking about another person switches because they don't want to think of like the other person as a person when they had not done this before. So, but like, you know, desire's a hard thing. It's like what you want is what you want, and you kind of see the world that way too. Degrading, equalizing addresses of other as a future victim, irrational claims to power, finally self-deprecation. All these manipulative rhetorical patterns are not about the factual level, but about the relational level, specifically about the degradation and destabilization of the counterpart, who is thus to be psychologically prepared for the planned asymmetrical war, which may soon escalate in physical form. Accordingly, one has to pay attention to these speech patterns as anticipatory, sham legitimations of violence in order to preventively counteract the escalation of the three types of violence according to the Ritzma and their transgression through hyperviolence. Excessive violence can only be stopped from a criminological point of view if it is recognized in the early stages, which can still be grasped linguistically and therefore linguistically before it becomes, as with Hannah Arendt, violently mute, and abusive hands or outright instruments of destruction speak. I mean, I don't actually understand this sort of progression. When do you stop violence? Before it's violence, then it's not violence. But like, yeah, I don't quite get. I don't know enough of this theory here. But it's like, you have to get people not to do this stuff somehow, and that way it is better before escalation happens. It's like you have to de-escalate. And people do not understand escalation, I've realized. It's very hard to actually understand escalation. And I don't know exactly what they're saying here, because escalation is kind of subtle. People will escalate in various ways and various things. And so it's like this linguistic claim that you can do something linguistically before it escalates to something else. I don't understand how the linguistic escalates into the non-linguistic and why that happens, and how linguistic changes can prevent the de-escalation or prevent the escalation and will de-escalate. But like, that's something I don't quite get. And I feel like this is a very modern sort of thing. Like, the rational speech can actually de-escalate certain things. And I'm not doubting that it does. I just don't understand the mechanism there, because I know behavioral therapy works. So, one last interesting question on the connection between hyperviolence of the sovereign and its language should be mentioned here. What actually stands at the beginning of the fatal energeia of the sovereign? What triggers it? Yeah, this is part of what I was asking. The answer is, in his perverted understanding of himself and the world, the sovereign has an initial cause that lies in his deviant understanding of time. His energeia is constituted in particular by a strongly disruptive reference to time. He lives completely in the present moment in an instant, without traditional or legal justification. He wants to reenact historical developments or reverse processes of modernity through violent action. I mean, but this is weird. If you are if you're living in the present, are you really thinking about reversing processes of modernity or reenacting historical development? Like, how does that happen if you're living only in the present? Like, what is it to reenact something historical if you live in the present only? He creates and controls the state of emergency with arbitrary special legislation. That's fair, but that's making everyone else live in your present moment too. That's what a state of emergency is that everything has to be like right now. But like, that's bringing everyone with you. That's okay. Okay, and the sovereign intends to found a new time in which everything is different from now on. That's fair too. As a rule, a dictator has a distorted reference to time, which is exposed linguistically in the run-up to acts of violence, in that the perpetrator of excessive violence announces his action and at the same time mystifies it in an unprecedented yesterday or a utopian tomorrow. Any acute reference to time, which in philosophical ethics would be a rational basis for responsibility, is missing in the understanding of being of the absolute offender who is accountable to no one. Yeah, this is like they're timeless. That makes some sense. The energeia of the sovereign, which is largely based on disruption and provides irrational, illusory legitimations for violence, is thus systematically the refusal of those paradigms which, at the latest since modernity, have been regarded as culture forming in their self-understanding. Renunciation of violence by the individual and the state, dignity, justification, reason, preservation of individuality. The sovereign is therefore, as it was in Homer's time, only today much more appalling, an indicator of cultural degradation. Wherever hyperviolence occurs and its typical actor, the sovereign, the modernity, and with it, the project of democracy is endangered by this anti-modern, anti-democratic type. It's like, yes, it's working against it. Again, it's annoying me. It's just saying, look, you're doing something against it, but this is not providing solutions. It's providing sort of a description, which is okay too. But like, I'm like, this worries me that like it just seems sort of like, well, we've got these crazy people that do crazy things, and we just kind of like got to get rid of them somehow. Like, that seems sort of weak. Analysis. Like, how do you push back? And they said just up here, like this one little bit, it's like, oh, you got to talk about it somehow. This is linguistic stuff. Where was that? No, it was somewhere in here. Sorry, I didn't mark it off. Yeah, linguistic things. So, but yeah. Okay, conclusion. If citizens, institutions, and states want to protect democracy today, they must become more sensitive to recognize the violent criminal type of sovereign at an early stage, because hyperviolence is its characteristic behavior pattern and will come to light sooner or later due to its inherently excessive nature. The sovereign, as self-appointed lord of the state of emergency, is a danger not only to peace, but also to the cultural and legal achievements of modernity, its understanding of itself and of norms, and its liberal conception of man. Well, I mean, I don't particularly love modernity, like the way modernity treats us too. Of course, I don't like violence, but like, you know, again, why are we predicting something that has led to this sort of state of emergency? Maybe this is part of the problem, is that modernity did not handle people well enough. And that is what is leading us to, more violence in our society. And I'm speaking about the United States right here. And everyone agrees that, like, things are going in a bad direction. No matter what side of, like, the political spectrum you're on, everyone thinks it's bad. And so this is the issue. And we're always in a state of emergency. If you look at cable news, like, it's excessive. And, like that sort of discussion we should have. But I don't know what this is, like just going back to the way things were. It sounds terrible. An ironic break in this argumentation, however, lies in the question of whether totalitarian modernity as such can still have a normative claim at all, or whether it is not based on normopathy, or does not perhaps even promote sovereignty with its excessive use of force. This is what I was just worried about. It's like maybe it creates it. The historical project of civilization, fragile and by no means linear, and its temporary enlightenment, always a work in progress, depends on whether its seemingly epic-spanning shadow, the sovereign, remains recognizable as an anti-type and does not become a new habit or even an ideal. And you know what? That's exactly what I was saying. It's like, how do we know this? And at the end, the person realizes, I mean, you got to give the author credit. Maybe this isn't what the purpose of this essay was. But if you're going to say all this stuff, maybe it's not because this is just you have to take some responsibility here. Modernity did not deal with people well enough. And if it does not understand people well enough, you're going to have problems. And maybe this is one of the problems that you're getting because the moderns don't have everything right. And that's not a knock on them. No metaphysicians, no philosophers do have everything right. But then we have to find what did not go right in their philosophy that we can do better now in order to, not end up with crazy people trying to blow crap up, which we got a lot of nowadays. Yeah, it's like, again, this thing was like, what we're going to do, start talking about stuff, like in the criminology. Where was that? I don't know. Yeah, it seems very, this linguistic, it was right over here. Excessive violence can only be stopped from a criminological point of view if it is recognized at the early stages, which can simply grasp linguistically and therefore linguistically before it becomes final. With Hannah, right? Yeah, so this whole thing, this long sentence. But I'd have to check up what this one Cohen and Felsen reference in 1979 is. It's like, come on, this is 2020. This is getting on 43 years ago, and is this really the only way from a criminological point of view to stop it? Like 40-year-old, I mean, it could be right, of course. I miss maybe a classic thing that everyone quotes, but like, is that really the best we got at the moment? And what new things might we be doing that are different from the moderns that could, again, not have the problem of the moderns? Because this seems like we're in this sort of, we've inherited this way of thinking, we've inherited their problems, and this has not got the resources to stop it. It just doesn't. We are in a constant state of emergency, basically, on cable news. Like, there's a constant state of outrage, is basically. And then we've got people, that like to manipulate this, and that's kind of what we have. And what's his name? That terrible person who goes lies constantly. That was saying that Sandy Hook was fake. Alex Jones. It's like, like this is what we get. It's like he just is like saying, oh, all these terrible things, always. And it's like, and the guy doesn't seem to have a grasp of time or place or something. He just says whatever crazy crap comes to his head, and people glom on because it's sort of exciting to be in this sort of state too. And it's like, maybe that's what people are missing. That this thing, being in this what was this? The state of emergency is a lot of, it's exciting, you know? People are looking for meaning, and it is exciting to feel like you're part of something, that there's like things happening. And so maybe that's the problem. We've over-rationalized due to the modernity, and it's made everything a little too boring, and people are breaking out of it. It's like, this is what fascism feeds off of too. You're in some grand destiny, and that you can all work towards some grand destiny. And that's what one of the allures of fascism is, that like there's something that bigger that you're going to be part of. But yeah, again, like this my biggest complaint with this paper is just that it was descriptive but didn't have a whole lot to. I don't know if it had a lot to say in the end. It just tells me kind of a way to define what's going on here, and I don't really know. You know, that seems okay. Maybe it's fine. Like I just don't know enough about the area that is doing hard work of getting these ideas clear, or is it just, you know, giving a few definitions of like modernity and the way that it's broken down at this point, which is fine too. Like that's a legit bit of philosophy. I am your Lord and God. Yeah, this is very fascistic. Okay, I don't know if I got anything else to say. Anyone else have anything else to say? But yeah, I need to go get some more water. So I thank everyone for being here.